I think that's us. So everybody, I would like to welcome you this evening to the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society and to one of our talks within our programme from 2020 to 2021. You'll be aware with the COVID pandemic, we've gone online and we are presenting on Zoom. And we've had a very successful time doing that all year. And it gives us a wider reach. So this evening, just for a quick introduction about Edinburgh Bibliographical Society, we are the oldest bibliographical society in the world. We were founded in 1890, and we promote the study of books and manuscripts of any date, and these are particularly Scottish, and prints, and we have an annual journal and monographs in our occasional publication series. Or membership, for those that haven't joined, you will get your journal, your occasional publications, and our annual lecture series. For an individual, it's £18, corporate £25. You'll find information on Facebook and also on our website. Just look for Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. So this evening, just some technical issues before I introduce our speaker. Please turn your camera off to improve your connection. As I've said, leave your microphone muted to minimize background noise. During the talk, there you can use the chat at the very bottom to make comments or to ask questions, and we'll be looking at them at the end of the meeting. And if you're retweeting about the event, please use the hashtag Edinburgh Bibliographical SOC, and please note that this talk is being recorded. So tonight I would Letterbook. Louise is an Honorary Research Fellow at the Edinburgh University Centre for Research Collections, and she is there working on the Royal Letterbook. And she has taken her title for tonight as the Royal Correspondence in late 14th century England, exploring the Royal Letterbook, Edinburgh University Library Manuscript 183. And I'd like to hand over to Louise.
Right, so share screen. There we are. How does this now go? Share. Right, good, from the beginning. Right, there we are. First question, can you hear me properly? Heather, can you hear me properly?
Yes.
And can you see the introductory slide?
Yes.
Good. In which case I will start by thanking you for your kind introduction, and also by thanking the committee for asking me to give this talk in the first place. And before I start my talk, I would just like to say something about the images that I will be using, in particular the images of various of the folios within the Letterbook. These images are nice and clear on a large screen, but obviously much smaller and therefore more difficult to see in detail on a computer screen. So if you feel that there's any image that you would like to view in greater detail at some other time, please just send me an email after the talk and I'm very happy to let you have a copy. I mean, there are big advantages to being online. The one disadvantage is, of course, that the pictures are very much smaller. Anyway, at the end of last month's talk, Derek Taylor kindly advertised today's talk by saying that while Joe Marshall had taken us into the future, I would now be taking you several hundreds of years back into the late Middle Ages. That was, of course, entirely correct. By discussing a 14th century manuscript, we will, of course, be spending a considerable amount of time in the distant past. However, one of the really interesting aspects of my work on this manuscript is that it combines historical research with the most recent developments in archive and preservation technology. So at the end of the talk, I too will be bringing you back to where we are now, and I might even lead you a short way into the future, just as Joe described it in his talk last month. So, what is the Royal Letterbook that I'm going to talk about? It is actually not much of a book at all, but rather a fairly random collection of folios, which was allowed to grow and change over a period of at least 40 years, probably more, and was only bound at a much later stage. And the same seems to apply to its companion volume, which you can see here. In its current form, the Royal Letterbook is an English late medieval manuscript consisting of 128 folios, and it contains contemporary copies of 374 letters in Latin and French. These letters are mostly royal, and mostly from the reign of Richard II of England, and he is here. However, there are about 50 letters from the earlier reign of Edward III, and about a dozen from the subsequent reign of Henry IV. And there's even a letter from the reign of Henry's son, Henry V. Politically, this was the period of the 100 Years' War, of the Peasants' Revolt, of the Great Western Schism of the Catholic Church, of the Anglo-Scottish Wars, and of the Black Death, most of which make an appearance in the Letterbook. It was also the time of Thomas Hoccleve, Geoffrey Chaucer, and John Gower, and a general period of transition in England when the English language started to be used as a written language, when the first stirrings of the impending Reformation were being felt, and it was less than 50 years before the first printing press was going to be invented in around 1440. The Royal Letterbook itself forms part of the very considerable manuscript collection which the antiquarian and collector David Laing left to the University of Edinburgh when he died in 1878, and I will come back to him later. As we all know, a great deal of research has been done on a variety of medieval documents, particularly during the 19th century. However, for some reason, this particular collection has remained relatively obscure. Several academics have worked on individual letters or on groups of letters, but so far, no one has produced an index of the entire contents. The purpose of my own research is therefore to create a calendar of the entire manuscript, which might help us to find out what the Royal Letterbook really consists of and who may have put it together and for what purpose. Also, such a calendar would then help future researchers to find any specific information within the Letterbook more easily. This talk will consist of 5 parts. I will begin by saying something about the provenance of the manuscript. I will then provide a physical description. This will be followed by a short description of its contents, and then I will try to deal with the potential authorship and purpose of the collection. Finally, I would like to say something about what has been achieved so far and set out any future plans. So to start with, a few comments on the provenance of the manuscript and how did it end up in Edinburgh. It would appear that originally the collection of letters, which now forms the Royal Letterbook, was bound or at least kept together with some very different material, such as a copy of the Floris Dictaminis by Peter de Venise, a collection of proverbs in Latin, and fragments of a letterbook in French. The first evidence of the potential ownership of the combined manuscript is this entry on the verso side of the final folio, Sum liber Tome Nichols. Together with this short text and this sign here, which may indicate that Thomas Nichols may well have been a late medieval notary. At some later stage, the collection was foliated, as you can see here, probably sometime during the 16th or 17th century, with the miscellaneous collection being given the folio numbers 1 to 26, and the letter collection being given the folio numbers 27 to 154. Within the current Royal Letterbook, the numbers are consecutive throughout, with just 3 or 4 omissions. The folios within the miscellaneous collection have got slightly mixed up, but on the whole, it would seem likely that most of the folios of the combined manuscript were already in their current order when they were foliated. There is then no further evidence of the fate of the manuscript until apparently in 1818, and here I would like to apologize for the very poor quality of this image, but the original is in fact not much better. So the 1818 is very faint here, and it's there in the original, on the whole page. Anyway, a man called Arthur Taylor put his name on the recto side of the very first folio, which you can see there. This is likely to have been the antiquarian Arthur Taylor, who lived from 1390 until 1870, was fairly widely published in his day, and became a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London. Next, we have a little handwritten note, which informs us that following Taylor's death, the manuscript was offered for sale at Sotheby, Wilkinson and Hodge in November 1871. At that auction, it was apparently bought by the Edinburgh antiquarian David Laing, who put his name inside the manuscript pretty much straight away in December 1871. David Laing himself then died only a few years later in 1878 and left his entire, very considerable manuscript collection to the University of Edinburgh, where it is still known as the Laing Collection, and where the manuscript was eventually given the reference number Laing 351. And when the Historical Manuscripts Commission reported to Parliament on the Laing manuscripts in 1914, they had this to say in their third entry on page 1. This here is the third entry. A register of letters, etc., 1300 to 1500, registrum epistolarum, etc., being a record of letters to and from kings and queens of England, Scotland, and foreign countries, popes, bishops, and other dignitaries, written on vellum and bound in a volume of 154 folios. Part of the book appears to be a notary's style book. Only 2 years later, in 1916, Catherine Borland published a catalogue of the Western medieval manuscript in Edinburgh University Library. By then, the two parts of the manuscripts had obviously been split, rebound, and given new reference numbers, appearing now as MS 182, the miscellaneous collection, and MS 183, the Royal Letterbook. And if you look closely at both volumes have at the bottom of the inside back cover a very small binder's mark consisting of the letters WHS within an oval shape. The university library appears to have used as bookbinders the stationers and booksellers W.H. Smith, who were providing bookbinding services at that time, and actually go back to 1792. As you can see here, Catherine Borland devoted an entire page, and it's from there right down to there, to her entry for the Royal Letterbook, saying inter alia, "This is a collection of great importance, but it is difficult to give a more detailed description of its contents without calendaring it fully. It is hoped, however, that the Royal Historical Society will shortly publish it in the Camden series." This, however, does not seem to have happened. Instead, in 1933, the Royal Historical Society published Édouard Perrois' diplomatic correspondence of Richard II, in which he included transcriptions of letters from various sources, including many of the letters contained in the Royal Letterbook, together with an extensive introduction and a series of helpful notes. Since then, Dr. A.L. Brown from Glasgow and Dr. Gwilym Dodd from Nottingham have used the Royal Letterbook for their work on medieval clerks. And Dr. Margaret Harvey from Durham refers to several of the letters in her book on the English merchant community in medieval Rome. This, however, still leaves more than 200 letters which do not appear to have featured in any publications at all, and the collection itself remains relatively unknown and difficult to access. In its current binding, the Royal Letterbook is roughly A4 in size, with a thickness of about 4.5 centimeters, and it consists of 128 vellum folios, almost all of which are closely written on both sides. The vellum is mostly quite thick and appears to be of slightly inferior quality, with several folios showing stretch marks, as you can see here, and other original faults. There's a little hole up there. There are a couple of places where individual folios were subsequently cut out, and there's evidence of a few repairs. Here, for example, this bit has been stuck on later. In some parts of the letterbook, a few folios are rather dirty, like this very last folio, and there are a few stains. But on the whole, most of the folios are in remarkably good condition. Next, we come to the question of how the manuscript has been put together. The 128 folios are arranged in altogether 19 quires, which consist of anything between 2 and 12 folios, with 8 being the most common. As you can see here, the only part of the letterbook which is arranged in a consistently orderly fashion is, strangely, the middle section, which consists of 40 folios. These 40 folios are arranged in 5 quires of 8 folios each, with catchwords linking the individual quires, as, for example, here. You have d'Aquitaine up here, but you also have d'Aquitaine down at the bottom here. It's very faint, but it is definitely there. It therefore seems likely that these 40 folios in the center of the collection are still in the order in which they were placed when they were originally written on. Furthermore, you will find that the 40 folios of the middle section all appear to be in the same hand, quite possibly written by the same scribe, whose hand does not appear anywhere else in the letterbook. When you then also consider the contents of this middle section, which consists of letters with a date range mainly between 1385 and 1393, it would appear that this may well have been a self-contained collection in its own right. The first and final sections of the letterbook, on the other hand, are nowhere near as neatly organized, but at the same time, the overall impression is that these two sections are quite similar to each other, particularly if you look at the writing. This one is from the first section, that is from the last section. The date range of the letters appearing in these two sections is much wider and stretches from the 1340s to about 1414. They appear to share either the same dominant hand or possibly two or more hands, which are very similar to each other. However, in addition to this dominant hand or hands, the first and final sections of the letterbook also contain a considerable number of letters which are written in altogether different hands, such as this. And then we have this folio, where you can distinguish at least 3 different hands. This folio is particularly interesting, as it starts with a letter from Henry IV, in other words, quite late in the general context of the collection. That letter is then followed by 2 further letters in very different hands. And the first 2 of these 3 letters then had marginal comments added to them in a different hand again. These marginal comments, strangely, appear to be in something like the dominant hand of the first and final sections of the collection, which, from the point of view of dating, is really rather puzzling. And I will come back to this. As we have already seen, the writing style of the letterbook as a whole consists of a variety of cursive hands and is generally neat but not elaborate, although there are a few folios which don't look quite so neat. Individual copy letters are not divided into separate paragraphs, even if they are quite long, like this one, which then continues on the verso side as well. The writing itself is small, the lines are close together, the gaps between individual letters are quite narrow, and there are no fancy initials, just the occasional little flourish. Finally, descriptive headings and marginal comments. In the middle section of the letterbook only, we find the occasional heading containing a brief description of the letter in question. One example is this one, which appears to be in the same hand as the text of the letter copy itself, and was therefore presumably inserted at the time of copying. It's this one here, which does look very much like the 2 letters above and below. However, all the other such headings, such as these ones here, seem to be in a hand that is slightly different from that of the main text. And it looks as if these headings might have been squeezed in at a later stage. In addition, about half of the letters in the collection have been provided with descriptive marginal comments, sometimes quite simply repeating the wording of the pre-existing heading, such as here, which reads Presentatio ad Ecclesiam, and then we have exactly the same in the marginal comment. Throughout the Letterbook, these marginal comments all seem to be in what appears to be the dominant hand of the first and final sections of the Letterbook, or certainly very similar. So what about the contents of these letters? And here I would just like to go back to the description given by the Historical Manuscripts Commission in 1914, which we saw earlier and which provides an excellent starting point. A register of letters, 1300 to 1500, registrum epistolarum, etc., being a record of letters to and from kings and queens of England, Scotland, and foreign countries, popes, bishops, and other dignitaries. The collection is indeed extraordinarily wide-ranging, both geographically and by subject matter. However, in addition to this largely international correspondence, the Letterbook also contains about 90 letters which deal with domestic concerns. And at that time, domestic concerns would include any matters relating to the administration of Aquitaine or Gascony, which was, of course, an English possession. In fact, I could easily give several talks on the contents of these letters alone, but that is obviously not possible today. Instead, I will briefly introduce just a very few of these letters to you, after having first explained something of the challenges of dealing with these copies. I have already touched on the paleography and shown you examples of the various hands. Next is the language in which these letters are written. This is Latin for about 2/3 of them and French for the rest. And the choice of language would usually have depended on the identity of the addressee. Much more complicated than either the paleography or the language, however, are the questions of dating the individual letters and of identifying the persons involved. Although some of these copies do include the date of the original letter, many do not. And in many cases, even the original letter may not have shown the year in which the letter was written. Unfortunately, the order in which the letters appear in the Letterbook does not provide much help in this context, as it is virtually impossible to follow how they were put together. There are occasional sequences, either in order of date or by subject matter, but in general, each individual letter has to be considered entirely separately, and ultimately, you can only establish the date, or at least a date range, for most of these letters by carefully researching the historical context of the letters in question. The same often applies to the people involved. Although some letter copies do expressly name the correspondents, with others, you have to work out for yourself who they might have been by considering the form of address used, and again, the historical context. And the same frequently applies to those individuals who are mentioned within the letters. So, as one of my main objects is to identify and list as many individuals as I possibly can, this is a slow process. On the other hand, I'm pleased to say that to date, I have managed to identify just over 400 separate individuals, and the list is still growing. Now back to the letters themselves. And here is a very straightforward administrative letter from the middle section of the Letterbook, the undated copy of a signet letter granting an annual pension to Notre Armée Clerk R. Frye. And I will return to Robert Frye in just a minute. Next, there is a letter from the first section of the Letterbook, a letter from Richard II, le roi d'Angleterre et de France, to a Count de la Salle, and to 23 other individuals, all of whom are named at the bottom. This letter is dated at Nottingham on the 14th of July in the 16th year of Richard's reign, which makes it the 14th of July, 1392. The letter refers to the truce agreed at Loylingham in the Pas-de-Calais 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1389, and it appears to be a letter from Richard II to his officials in Gascony, informing them of the extension of the earlier truce. And at the same time, it provides for us, of course, a very useful record of who the important officials in Gascony would have been at that time. Let us now move to Scotland. And here, and it's the second letter here at the bottom, is another letter which contains a large number of names, but in a very different context. This is a letter to, rather than from, the king. The writer of the letter is anonymous, and the letter is undated, but the original was probably written in mid-late August 1388. The letter contains the report of an attack on Carlisle by Scottish forces. And it mentions by name, and here we have the Earl of Douglas, the Earl of Fife, this is probably Alexander Hume, the Earl of March, the Earl of Strathearn, the Earl of Mar, the Earl of Orkney, and Monsieur Archibald Douglas. And still on a Scottish theme, a letter from John, Lord of the Isles. And here he is, Johannes de Ile, Dominus Insularum, which is right at the bottom here. To Richard II. As you can see here, the letter was written on the island of Colonsea. And here we have Col-1-sea, there's a W in the middle there. Possibly as early as 1377, just after Richard's accession to the English throne. In this letter, the Lord of the Isles refers to the excellent relationship which he had had with the late Edward III, and he expresses the hope that the same good relationship may continue between him and the new King of England, Richard II, even if there might be war, by which he presumably meant that in a war between England and Scotland, the Lord of the Isles might well choose not to support the Scottish side. And finally, something very different. The copy of a letter of 1340, which apparently was rather famous at the time. The original letter was written 3 days after Edward III had started the siege, his siege of the city of Tournai, and the King of France, Philip VI, was approaching Tournai with his forces. In the letter, Edward challenges this French king, and here he is, Philippe de Valois, which is taken from up there. No titles, absolutely nothing, so really quite rude by the standards of the age, was approaching Tournai with his forces. In the letter, he challenges the French king to let the siege be decided by single combat between the two kings. Sadly for Edward, Philip did not respond to his challenge, and the siege was eventually ended by the agreement of a truce. However, the challenge proved to be very popular with Edward's followers, and the letter was subsequently copied many times. One example being this copy here in the Royal Letterbook. A few comments now regarding the potential authorship and purpose of the collection. The Royal Letterbook contains a mix of letters and in particular and unusually contains letters from 2 different royal writing offices, the Signet Office and the Privy Seal Office, each of which would have had its own separate complement of clerks, although it did occasionally happen that an individual clerk would transfer from one office to the other. Trying to identify the hands of individual clerks is a risky business, and we certainly have no indication of the identity of the clerk or clerks who created the middle section of the letterbook. However, we seem to be much better informed when we come to the predominant hand of the first and third parts of the collection. It seems likely that the clerk who copied the great majority of these letters was a man called Robert Frye, whom I mentioned earlier. Robert Frye is fairly well documented. He started his career as a clerk in the Signet office in the late 1380s, moved from there to the Privy Seal office in about 1390, spent several years as clerk to the King's Council, and eventually retired in the early 1420s, having served in various roles under Richard II, Henry IV, and even under Henry V. A very long and apparently successful career spanning about 40 years. He is, for example, mentioned in this entry in the calendar of patent rolls for the reign of Richard II, and it is this entry down here, and it reads 1399, January the 28th, Westminster. Grant for life to the King's Clerk Robert Frye for 12 years good service in the offices of the King's Privy Seal and Signet, of £10 a year out of the issues of the county of Wiltshire. So from that, we can learn that even in 1399, he had already been a clerk in these offices for 12 years. So that goes back to at least 1387. And as we just heard, he then lived on until 1420. And as we saw earlier, even the letterbook itself contains in its middle section a reference to Robert Frye, here on folio 83 recto, where the first letter states that he is to be granted an annual pension by the abbot of Ramsey Abbey in Cambridgeshire. Most importantly, though, the National Archives in Kew hold a small collection of Robert Frye's personal correspondence, so that even his handwriting is known to us. Here, for example, is a letter to his mother, Agnes Frye. It's this letter here, which he signs as your humble son, humilis filius Vester. And then he uses this rather unusual initial F. The same initial F also appears in this original letter from Richard II and his council to Charles VI of France, which Frye signed in his capacity of clerk to the council. But this time, Frye has completed his name by adding the letters R-I-E at the bottom. So we have his complete name there. And what have we here? The same initial, oops, go back. No. The same, no. I'm sorry for this. Right. The same initial F, you can see at bottom right of the folio. This time at the end of a letter in a copy letter in the Royal Letterbook. So is this evidence that Robert Frye himself produced substantial parts of this collection? Certainly a very attractive idea, and particularly tempting as Frye had such a very long career and would therefore have been quite capable of copying the majority of the earlier letters in the collection. But then also add marginal notes to copies that were clearly inserted at a much later stage in the production of the manuscript. And just to add something more to the mix, an image of an original letter from Richard II to Pope Boniface IX, probably of July 1394, very possibly in Frye's hand. And here is a copy of that letter in the letterbook. And just to add something more to the mix, apparently in the same hand, but less elaborate and containing abbreviation such as this here, pater, where it's PAT with a little swell. And then here, of course, in the original, you have the full word fully spelled out. And the B is very much more elaborate than in the copy, obviously. So enough of Robert Frye, and on to the potential purpose of a collection like this. Was it just simply a record of what had been sent out, or in some cases come in? Some sections of the collection look a little like this, others not at all. Or was it meant as a style collection or a formulary? But then why include dozens of letters on similar matters or between the same correspondence? Or was this perhaps part of an exercise by which the incoming administration under Henry IV was trying to gather information on what had been going on under the previous reign? All these are possibilities which invite a great deal of further research, as does the question of the wider context in which the letterbook finds itself amongst other similar manuscripts. And finally, a few words about the current state and future plans regarding this project. At this stage, all the information that I have so far managed to extract from each of the letters is, not surprisingly, in a giant spreadsheet, which I continuously update. And the same applies to the roughly 400 individuals who have so far made an appearance. On the publishing front, I would like to mention that in December 2018, Philip Bennett, Sarah Carpenter and I published a joint article in the journal Medium Evum on a group of 5 very unusual letters from the Royal Letterbook, which I have sadly not had time to go into. However, as I indicated at the beginning of this talk, it's no longer all spreadsheets and print. As for the interface between a medieval document and its accessibility by means of modern technology, Edinburgh University's archive space now has a full online catalogue entry for the Royal Letterbook. And this catalogue entry also provides access to the information available on each individual letter, as it was about 18 months ago, just before COVID hit us. This information will therefore need to be updated once things return to normal. In addition, if you're looking for information on a particular person, or would just like to know whether that individual makes an appearance in any of the holdings of the special collections, then you can go straight to the Names tab. And the result might look like something like this. Here we have Edmund Stafford, who was Bishop of Exeter and Lord Chancellor, and we learn that he appears 11 times. I must admit, all the 11 times is in the Royal Letterbook. But if he appeared anywhere else, that would probably show up too. There's also a plan to scan the whole Letterbook in so that researchers would be able to access its entire content remotely. And as many of you will know, there are already moves to develop handwriting recognition software, which might one day be used for transcribing medieval texts. Similarly, translation software has been around for quite a long time and is becoming more and more sophisticated. Although based on my own experience of being involved with the translation of legal and commercial texts, my confidence in the quality of these offerings is still distinctly limited, but then you never know. And finally, you will probably not be surprised to hear that, being a skeptic, I would hope to publish a print version of a full calendar of the manuscript eventually. Thank you.
Louise, thank you very much for that fascinating talk and that very comprehensive introduction into such a fascinating document. We don't have any chat, but what I will do is start by asking a question. You've mentioned a number of historians that had referred to and that have used the Letterbook in their research. Why do you think so few people have made use of it?
That's a very interesting question. There are obviously other collections like this, but in particular, there's one in the University Library in Cambridge, and there's one at All Souls College at Oxford in the library there. Those two manuscripts, which do have a sort of similar contents, have been used very extensively, and they are quoted a lot. But then they were calendared at a relatively early stage, so they were made much more widely available. The other thing is that I think it's the distance from Oxford, Cambridge, London, and so on. There is a little book, for example, that was published in the 1930s, which is about signet clerks. And it goes in great detail into these two manuscripts. And then there is one little footnote saying, and then of course there is the manuscript up in Edinburgh, but I haven't seen it. So yes, it just hasn't perhaps been quite so easy to look at.
Thank you very much for that. You mentioned that you'll eventually publish a calendar. Do you have any plans as well for any articles or any other research on some of the subject matter in the letters?
Well, there is that article, of course, by that already about the jousting letters that I mentioned. That, I mean, I only contributed a section about the Letterbook itself. The article was mostly about the contents of the letter, which I did not contribute to. I think probably not, because there are 374 of these letters. And if I really want to get to the contents of each one of these and produce a calendar, and also make sure, and that as a historian I'm very, very keen on, that all the individuals that are mentioned in any of the letters are also then appear in that calendar. That is a great deal of work. And the temptation is always, of course, with something like this, that you think there are various subjects which are hugely interesting, historical subjects, but also paleography. How is this thing put together? What did the clerks do? And. I mean, the temptations of following particular subjects are enormous, but I try to concentrate on what I really want to achieve, which is produce this calendar.
Thank you for that question. We have some questions in the chat. Graham Lyle is saying, I recall that there was at least one slightly strange letter in the collection, rather fantastical, I think. Can you remind me?
Yes, that is what that article is about. There are actually 5 of these letters, and strangely 3 of them are in the middle bit of the letter book and 2 are in one of the other bits. So how that has come about, I have no idea. They are letters between ladies at the court setting up a joust. And there is one, and it's all in fantastical names. The ladies are not named by name, but quite often you can work out, for example, that the addressee is Philippa of Hainaut, the Queen of Edward III, and they were clearly for a joust at the court of Edward III. But they are extremely unusual, and there is only one other collection like this, and that was for a joust in 1401, so about 50 years later, at the court of Henry IV, when what's his name, the Emperor of Constantinople made his journey around Europe to collect money to fight the Muslims, and he was entertained in London for about a fortnight, and jousts were set up to entertain him, not surprisingly. And there is a collection of letters, very, very similar letters, which is also preserved.
Thank you for that. And Taylor, thank you so much, Louise, for sharing your fascinating research with us. Regarding the content of the letters, you referred a few letters in relation to Scotland, Lord John of the Isles, for example. Are these the only Scottish examples in the letter books, or are there others? There are a few others. Altogether, there are 8. But these are clearly the most interesting one. I mean, one is it's also quite interesting, actually. It's setting up what is it, a meeting between the English and the Scottish authorities to have a March day, organizing that, and where they want it. Is it on one side of the river or on the other side of the river? Who is it going to be convenient for? So that's quite nice. But the others are very straightforward. But they obviously will appear too. Thank you. Robert Laurie is asking, are these letters known from other sources or not? I would say that's a mix. There are, what do you mean by other sources? Do they appear in other collections? I think he means probably other collections. Yeah, so the originals, yeah, or other original copies. Right, let me think. Well, obviously the one letter I showed about Edward III's challenge to Philip VI of France, that was obviously a letter that was widely copied, quite simply because it was so wonderful. And it also, therefore, is quite important. It's 1340, which is extremely early in relation to the rest of the letter book. And it may well be that it was a copy that was made much later because the letter was so well known. I have looked at both these manuscripts in Oxford and in Cambridge, and one of them, there is a very minor overlap. There are a handful of letters that appear in both, which in itself, of course, is very interesting because the 2 clerks who copied these 2 lots of letters obviously had access to the same originals. But again, that goes back to what was the purpose, why were they copied? Was it for personal use, in which case it would be easy to explain duplicates, or was it an official record, in which case why were they copied more than once? I don't know, but it does seem to happen. Thank you. We have Sebastian Sobecki. Thank you for this informative presentation. Do you have a rough tally or estimate of how many letters lack reference to a seal?
Most of them, the vast majority. There is reference to a seal in some of them, and therefore in my spreadsheet I have a little column for seal, and I was hoping to put a great deal of information in there, but quite frankly there isn't very much. I mean, I haven't counted it, but it is perhaps 10%, perhaps 20%, but not very much in relation to the whole collection.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions that they want to give to Louise? Here, Sebastian's come back, and
yes,
a second question. How many are the statue?
Sorry, what?
How many are, he says, D-E-S-T-A-T-U?
The statue, right. That is an interesting question. There are a few, again, I would say not an enormous amount. And I always find the statue, just to explain, are letters which are really just letters to keep in touch with between the correspondence. So it's a sort of letter where you say, we are well, how are you? Sort of thing, but not really, and perhaps telling the other person a little about what's happening, but not a content, not a query or anything that really demands an answer. The interesting thing I always find about the De Statu letters is that because they are obviously phrased in very polite terms, they are quite long. And therefore, I'm always worried that I'm missing something. I always wonder, does this really all not mean very much? Or am I missing a very important point? Because obviously the language is complicated, and obviously also there are quite a lot of abbreviations in these copies. So it is sometimes quite difficult to really work out what a word is. So there's always at the back of my mind the concern that perhaps I might not get what it really is trying to convey. And the De Statu letters certainly fall into that category.
Thank you very much for that answer. Claire, I don't know what her surname is. She says, thank you. I would like to thank you very much on behalf of Edinburgh Bibliographical Society, and I would like to thank you on behalf of everyone that has been here this evening for your fascinating talk, and for sharing your extensive research with us all here, and for telling us about these fascinating books and all the plans that you have for making all of this more widely available, which is absolutely fantastic to be able to share such unused medieval material with the research committee, and with researchers and anyone interested in medieval period. So thank you very much for that. So can I remind everybody that we're still continuing with our 2020 to 2021 programme, and our next speaker was scheduled to have been Tony Velikova, speaking at our next talk, but she's had to pull out. So we will now have a talk from Fiona Mossman, and she will be speaking about scripted summits, book history, mountaineering, and experiences of Janet Adam Smith, who lived from 1905 to 1999. So we will see you on Thursday, the 13th of May at the same time at 5:45. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Louise, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you.